Services Institute. He's in our central London studio, and joining me in the studio here, Jonathan Sacerdoti from the Institute for Middle Eastern Democracy. Thank you both for joining us. To you first of all, Jonathan, how serious is the situation tonight? I mean, we've seen further retaliation on both sides today.
Well, as we reach the end of the second day of the operation, it's a good moment to take stock and see what's happening. And as your report just explained, there appears to be a massing of Israeli soldiers nearby to Gaza in a staging area where they're able to, if they want to, say the word and go in for a boots-on-the-ground operation. That doesn't mean they've decided to do that, and it doesn't mean that it's necessarily imminent, but it does mean that they're keeping the possibility open. And of course, that in itself would be the next stage of this operation.
Shashank, Joshi, what's your reading? Do you think that Israeli troops are likely to go in on the ground?
I think that reading was exactly correct. I think they're probably still unlikely to do so. They are preparing for that eventuality, but actually moving ground forces into Gaza once again would have enormous ramifications. It would be incredibly messy, incredibly complicated. They would bear substantial casualties, and I think the Netanyahu government has absolutely no wish to do so unless there are some really pressing circumstances. Now, this afternoon we did get a taste of what those pressing circumstances could look like. I think we're now seeing missiles for the first time since 1991, during the first Gulf War, fall within range of Tel Aviv. Of course, in 2006, for the first time, rockets fell within range of Haifa. So this is really a progressive change. It's a really big shift in these campaigns. It is an inaccurate rocket. It didn't really hit the center of Tel Aviv. But if there are more Israeli civilian casualties in places like Tel Aviv or even elsewhere, I think that's the kind of trigger we could have for seeing ground forces on Gaza soil.
Jonathan, the situation is different to when tensions escalated to this level 4 years ago. Then the Egyptian president was was effectively on the side of what the Israelis were doing. This time, Egypt making absolutely clear it's siding with Hamas. How different does that dynamic make the situation this time around?
It's quite true that the Middle East is quite a different region than it was just 4 years ago, and that's an indicator of how quickly things can move in that part of the world. But it's not true, I think, to say that Egypt is necessarily totally against Israel defending itself. It is, of course, making the necessary noises in order to suggest that it disapproves of what Israel is doing, but Egypt has no interest at the moment in getting overly involved in this situation. Mohamed Morsi has, in his country, enough problems to deal with that he doesn't want to get involved in this sort of conflict. So Egypt is flexing its muscles, and we mustn't forget that Hamas is a local chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood and that Mohamed Morsi is a Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt. But that doesn't mean at all that Egypt is about to push this one way or the other. They are simply doing what they can to impose their strength in the region, to show that they have this strength, to show that they're no longer necessarily going to go along with everything that Israel does, but I don't think that will necessarily translate into any specific actions.
Shashank, do you think that Egypt doing things this time around, like sending the Prime Minister and top security officials into the Gaza Strip, will make Israel think very carefully about what it does?
Yes, I think it has to. I think, in fact, in terms of what it's done so far, it's withdrawn its ambassador, which, of course, is no different to what Hosni Mubarak did 4 years ago. So that step isn't particularly different at all. And I think I would have agreed with that analysis we just heard pretty much in its entirety. But the fact that Morsi has sent his Prime Minister into Gaza, or is planning on doing so, is a fairly serious step. It does mean Israel has to be extremely careful which targets it selects. It means that Hamas will take advantage of that opportunity. And I think it actually signifies a fairly shrewd move by Morsi. It's relatively low risk. It doesn't entangle him in the situation. It makes him continue to be relevant. And of course, President Obama said Egypt is a key actor in all of this from the outside. And yet it still applies pressure on Israel and satisfies the demands of some of his constituency that he do far more to pressure Israel. So I think it's a fairly clever move. I still think he probably will be drawn slightly further in. I don't think he can sit back and politically accept not showing a slightly more robust policy in the days ahead.
What would you say to that, Jonathan?
Well, I think it's absolutely very interesting what Morsi is doing, and I think that Hamas as well has shown what the Israelis call their technique of a double war crime, that they will fire at Israeli civilians, and they'll do so from behind a defence of Palestinian civilians, thus putting two sets of civilians at risk. And I think that it would be very foolish even for Hamas to do the same and fire rockets from behind Egyptian dignitaries. So I think that in that sense it is significant, of course, what Morsi is doing, but I think that to suggest that Israel is at risk of somehow damaging any Egyptian personnel is perhaps pushing it a bit too far, especially as of the deaths that there have been so far in the Gaza Strip, even Hamas themselves readily admit that most of those have been, in fact, terrorist bodies. And so it's quite clear that Israel, while it has been escalating its strikes on the territory, has been doing so in quite a surgical way, and it has been targeting very carefully using extremely good intelligence that it had in order to really maintain a situation where they are claiming that they are still protecting their civilian population from these rockets, whilst minimising to the highest possible degree the number of civilian deaths that they will cause within the territory.
Jonathan Sacerdoti and Shashank Joshi, thank you both.
Thank you.
Some breaking news.